I was saying, just for the benefit of people, that this walk is just to introduce you to this corner of Achill Island. It's a more low-lying part of the island, and it's one that has several small lakes. This one, Lough Dhu, which is probably an anglicisation of Lough Dove, which is the dark lake, because it's surrounded by peatland. So therefore the peat would make the water look dark. The one over beyond us is called Lough Namrach, which is the lake of the trout, or a fish, the salmon. And then Lough Gall is behind the Valley House. Eilish, what does Lough Gall mean, or does anybody know? Bright Lake, is it? Okay, so that obviously is another feature. And then we have Sruhill, which is actually a lagoon. It's a saline lagoon, which was where I wanted to bring you, just so we can go and see and explore that. And that's actually a saline lagoon, because there's kind of water coming in and out from the sea, and it gets quite flooded at times. Was it not that it became breached? Yeah, because then it would have been a fully functional lagoon. A lagoon would actually be separate from the sea. But what's happened, and we will see it when we go down there, is the actual coastline is disappearing down there. It's a peat coastline with a shingle beach, but unfortunately with the winter storms that we're getting, the coastline is eroding. The peat, which has been there for thousands of years, is now being broken up, and eventually maybe that lake will become an inlet of the sea. So I think it's good to see that. I mean, so maybe if we start just here. This, looking out on Lough Dhu, is at the far end of the lake. There's a wet marsh, and believe me, there's 5 or 6 pairs of a little bird called the lapwing, which is nowadays a rare nesting bird. It's a shorebird, and I'll just show you a picture because we won't be going down there. It's the national bird of Ireland. On Pilibeen or Peewit. You see it here? I don't know if anybody. That's in place of seeing the bird. Yes, yeah. So if you all see it, it's actually, that's the male. It's got, what makes it very distinctive, it's got this wonderful little crest of feathers. And in the past, this would have been a common bird on farmland, nesting. But because of the whole change, intensification of agriculture, drainage of the peatlands, land use change, it's become much rarer. And probably in the last 30, 40 years, like all these little birds that nest in open landscapes, these wading birds, they've declined by over 90% in Ireland as nesting birds. And there used to be another little bird called the dunlin that nested here. And there were 15 pairs here kind of in the 1980s. And now they've gone from practically everywhere in Ireland. So there might be 15 pairs left in Ireland. So just to give you an idea that, you come to an area like Achill Island and you think it's beautiful and it's natural and it's wild, but it's under pressure, like all places, in terms of the way the land is being changed. And of course, birds, over time, it's gradual. It doesn't happen from one year to the next. It happens over decades that species disappear, and then you notice that you don't hear the cuckoo anymore. The corncrake has gone from this landscape probably for decades. And so we're left with remnants of bird populations that would have been much more plentiful. So if you were to take a walk, and I would recommend over the coming few weeks, because the lapwing started nesting here in the beginning of April, and as Kathleen announced last night, the first nest of four chicks hatched out on Wednesday. There's probably 5 or 6 pairs in the valley here at the moment. There's a few more to hatch out over the coming days. And then there's birds. Now, the way that it's worked, this is part of an EU-funded project to protect the macaire. And what the project has done, and you can't unfortunately see it in the foggy weather, they've put an electric fence over the core area, around the core area. And what that has done is to keep the foxes out of the core area. They are also trying to remove crows, because the hooded crow, which is not an endangered species, they're doing very well. There's lots of them coming in, and they would rob the eggs. They wouldn't get to the hatching stage. So, this is where the balance of nature is disturbed, and nobody wants to actually do any harm to nature. But if the crows are preventing the lapwing and all the other birds from nesting, then you have to take some measures. It's not going to endanger the crow, but locally it means that it's a no-go area for crows. So the lapwing are hatching out. They've another 4 weeks to go before they are flying. So with some luck, these birds will succeed. And if it continues on a path of success, you could have 40 or 50 pairs of lapwing here in 10 years' time. Up in the Böll, BirdWatch Ireland has a nature reserve at Annamarsh, and they were down to 2 pairs of lapwing, and now they have 50 pairs because they really had a serious program of management, and they even have brought back some very, very rare birds. In winter, these lakes would attract some diving ducks, tufted ducks, and other species. There would be whooper swans coming in from Iceland. There are 2 species of swans we get here in winter. There used to be 3, but one, the Buick swan from Siberia, is staying in places like Germany and the Netherlands. It's milder in winter, so they don't come as far southwest. But the whooper swans do come from Iceland, and out on the macaire you'd get about 50 or 60 of them here. You get them over at Achill as well on the other side of the island. The one that's resident here is the mute swan. And there's actually a bird on the nest. You can see the white thing on the edge. So she's sitting on her nest over there for the last few weeks. And there's a nest on the other lake. There's a nest on Lough Gall, and there's a nest on Sruhill. And the extraordinary thing about the mute swan is, once the birds are nesting, they have zero tolerance for other mute swans. So you can see they're quite aggressive. The male, kind of with its wings outstretched, will obviously chase off other swans. Now, there are some young swans still hanging out on Sruhill, but they're at the opposite end of the lake because it's a much bigger space, so they're not as disturbed. Yeah. But they would be chased off by the parents. I mean, the thing about swans and geese is that the young stay with the parents for most of the first winter. But come the spring, the parents become obviously preoccupied with nesting, and they force the young to leave. So the young will head over to Achill. There's a big population of swans there for a lot of the year. So that's just to give you, and of course, the interesting thing about the mute swan, its history is that was considered in many countries to be a royal bird. It was the property of the king or the queen. So they were probably introduced into some areas. They would be eaten. It would obviously be a big feast compared to some of the birds. But it's obviously a wild bird here now on Achill Island. So the LIFE project is not only about protecting, the EU-funded LIFE project is not only about protecting the wading birds and bringing back those birds, it's also about protecting the habitat. The macaire habitat, which is this coastal grassland, it only exists in Scotland and Ireland, and it's linked to the fact that this is an extremely windy landscape. And instead of having sand dunes, we get flat coastal plains, which are rich in calcium, and under normal conditions they would be very rich in calcium tolerant and loving plants. So they tend to have a very unique flora, and this example here is a small area of Macker. There are bigger ones elsewhere in Ireland, but it's a very important area. And it's also not only important for the flowering plants, it's important for mosses and liverworts. It's quite unique. In fact, there's some species here that don't occur anywhere else in Ireland. So the project is trying to restore this habitat. If you walk out there, I was just saying before some people arrived, you'll see that there are actually exclosures. There are 2 by 2 meter exclosures which are intended to keep the sheep out, keep the grazers out. And what they're trying to do is, some are closed all year and some are closed for seasonally. What they want to work out is how the plants will recover, the vegetation will recover. So they will be able to try and define a good level of grazing so that the stocking of sheep and cattle, because there's cattle out there as well, will be at a level that is actually allowing the flora to thrive as well. So these systems, it's not about excluding grazing, it's about working with farmers to actually have a good level of grazing that is also good for nature. And I think that's the balance that we hope to would achieve here and in others. This area is a special area of conservation that's designated under the EU Habitats Directive. There are about 450 of these areas in Ireland. So these are probably the most important areas we have for nature, but all of them are, to a significant extent, have interactions with people. So, you have to work with the farmers, and it's really a question of how you incentivize them to actually do the thing, because this area is shared. It's a commonage. It's in shared ownership between something like 47, 48 people. So that makes it more complex, because you might get 46 people that want to do and engage with the project, and you get 2 that don't. And then it becomes more complex, but that's something that people will have to navigate through. The other thing, I guess, while we're overlooking this area before we move on, is you can see that there's a lot of turf cutting still here. And I tread carefully because I'm sure a lot of people, and maybe including people here, will actually burn turf. It's a traditional fuel on the island, and there's still a lot of it done on Achill. In an era of climate change, we have to ask the question, is this the best way to use peat? Because peat is a really important source of carbon, and peatlands actually hold more carbon than the forests on Earth, even if they're much more restricted. I kind of dream of a day where we will pay farmers to look after peatlands, and they will be carbon farmers. As well as looking after sheep and cattle, they'll be saying, I'm looking after carbon in the ground as part of our strategy for climate. But we're not there yet. And I think one of the things that needs to be obviously done is to find alternatives for people. Like new houses that are built nowadays have to be well insulated. They have to have solar panels or other forms of energy, and heat pumps, so that a new generation of housing will not need to burn peat. And then, of course, you need to support people in terms of transitioning away from using peat. On protected areas like the raised bogs, which are in the middle of Ireland, you shouldn't be cutting peat, but unfortunately it still goes on illegally. So I don't know, maybe I shouldn't be making too many political statements, but I think it's important to know that, these peatlands are still being damaged, including protected peatlands in Ireland. And of course, the big challenge across Europe, and I say this because I know there are German colleagues here, is I think in Ireland, in Germany, in all the countries across Europe, nature has been damaged big time. Our relationship with nature has been through exploiting it. And so one of the big things that we have to try and do in Europe is to restore and to pay people to actually restore areas that are degraded. And then we get healthy nature, we get all the benefits that healthy nature provides. And of course, that's I think a much better system that we would want to see in place. There was a European initiative, and I don't know if any of you have been following this, to a new nature restoration law that was being proposed over the past while. But it's actually run into a wall at the moment because there's some political resistance in terms of this law. It was passed by the European Parliament, and we thought the ministers from the different countries had all signed up to this, but at the last minute, one or two changed, and I think it's because the elections are taking place in across Europe in June. And this nature restoration law, which would have put a greater focus on what needs to be restored, how to restore it, and to try and provide funding for that, was, in my view, a good way forward. But it's stalled at the moment, and we'll see what happens after the European elections. But I think it's a more complex time we live in at the moment, and we'll see where that goes. So, any questions at this stage? I mean, we're not going down there today. We're going to walk around to this side of the lake, and be careful on the road, please. I mean, it's a gentle, quiet corner of Achill, but people do drive around here and sometimes fast. So be careful as we work down. We'll go down just the hill, and we'll stop at the corner before we turn left down to the lake, okay? We talk about nature, there's lots of different elements. And I just wanted to point out a few of the spring plants. When I think of spring on Achill, I'm always looking for primroses, which is kind of like, some people think about daffodils as being the harbingers of spring. I think of the primroses, and if you see just along here, you get little pockets of them where the grazing pressure isn't too intense. And the other plant that you have in the hedge there is the bluebells. So they've been flowering now for several weeks, so you'll get pockets of them. And they're signs of good, kind of long established hedgerows or woodland where you get them in a native state. You'll also get the dog violets along there, along the wall. But I just wanted to show you, there's a lot of concern globally and even in Ireland about the decline of pollinators. The insects, the bees, the butterflies, and there's a lot of interest, because if you don't have pollinators, a lot of the foods that we eat, the plants, they will not actually be fertilized, and they will not actually produce the fruit. So there's a greater amount of interest. I mean, I don't know if any of you participate in No Mow May, where, I mean, my front lawn is not the pride of the neighbourhood in terms of, I mow my lawn once a year, but it sort of allows the orchids and all the other plants to grow. But I think we should always try and not mow before May, because it gives the flowering plants a chance. But just as I was passing by here yesterday, you'll see that this little plant here, it's a typical kind of hedgerow plant that some people plant, cotoneaster. At this time of the year, it's a wonderful place, even on a wet and dreary day today. When I passed by yesterday, it was full of bumblebees. These are the common carder, which is kind of, it's one of the more common of the bumblebee. We've got about 100 species of bees in Ireland. There's about 20 species of bumblebees. There's about 80 species of what we call solitary bees. And the difference is the bumblebees live in colonies with a queen bee and workers, so that they have a hive living together, whereas most bees live in individual nests. So just to be aware that, there are pollinators. It's not a great day to see them. And of course the flies, but yeah, that's just the common card, which is probably the common. On Achill, the flora really doesn't come out until later in the month. I mean, it's kind of into June that you will get a much richer flora. And of course, where you get the heavy pressure of grazing, you don't get the flowering plants. So let's just take a walk down here, and maybe we'll stop when we get a good view over the lake. I'm not a big fan of artificial intelligence. I think it's going to take over the world. But there are some very valuable little tools that you can get, and even put them on your smartphone. And the one that I kind of recommend in the nature field is a thing called Merlin. It's from Cornell University. And this is a wonderful little tool to introduce you to bird song and bird sound. You can download it on your phone. And what you're doing, if you're on a walk in a woodland or in the countryside, what you simply do is you press the sound and it will listen to the birds for you. And it will tell you that that's house sparrow that's singing and they're chattering in the background. But on a nice day, particularly at this time of the year, because this is now when we've got peak of bird singing, you can walk through an area and you have your phone listening, and it'll tell you all the different birds that are singing. And I think it's just a very, very enriching way to experience the sounds of nature, because, I mean, probably one of the joys of being alive in spring is bird song. When you wake up in the morning and you start hearing the song thrush or the blackbird singing in your back garden, then you know that spring is coming, and it kind of gives you a bit more hope. There are birds like the robin that will sing in winter, but that's the exception. I mean, the robin will hold its territory throughout the winter. But most birds will only start singing kind of from March, late March into April. And probably these weeks in May are the best time to go out. And the best time of the day to go out is probably around 5 o'clock in the morning. Because so if you're coming back from the party, you've been at a late night party or out in the pub, you can actually turn on your phone. Now, yeah, I was kind of trying to see what that was. Merlin is an app, yeah. Yeah. So that's a blue tit. It should be telling me blue tit. So, yeah. But no. So I just think, that sometimes my sister, she's a retired GP in Naas. Now, she's not into birds, but she carries this with her everywhere, and she's always telling me about chaffinches and greenfinches and all these other birds in her neighbourhood that she probably didn't have any notion that they were there. And of course, birdsong is richest in woodlands and places that are kind of where there's lots of cover, where the birds are singing. Now, of course, the birds are singing because they've set up territories. They're also advertising for mates. When I was walking down here the other day, there was a little bird that I heard singing for the first time. It's a sedge warbler. It's a little songbird that has spent the winter in Africa. It lives in kind of wet, kind of sedgy areas, and it's come back here, and obviously they've just arrived back in the last week. Most birds have just come back from Africa in the last few weeks. I mean, I've heard the cuckoo only for the first time over at Dooniver in the last week. So, they've come back. And I I don't know if any of you have read in the newspaper or listened to an RTE, the national broadcaster, that there's a cuckoo that's returned back to Killarney in County Kerry in the national park, and it spent the winter in the Congo. So a lot of these birds will have crossed the Sahel. They kind of gone into sort of central southern Africa. The swallows will have gone as far as South Africa. So extraordinary journeys. And you know, last week, unfortunately, the geese, there was a flock of Brent geese here up to about Tuesday or Wednesday, but they've all flown up to Iceland now on their way to Canada. You get the changing of the guard in spring. The winter birds are leaving and the summer birds are coming in. So you sometimes get the two together. So which kind of is extraordinary in terms of the journeys that, you know, they like the sandwich terns, and we might see some when we go down onto the shore. They will have spent the winter off Ghana, West Africa, some going down as far as the Cape of, at the tip of South Africa. Whereas the Brent geese that have spent the winter here will be up at the very north of Canada in the high Arctic. So extraordinary the journeys that these birds will make. So I just want to introduce you to Sruhill. Sruhill is kind of one of the larger lakes. It would have been, as Sheila said, it would have been a lagoon enclosed, separate from the sea. There's only a small little stream that comes in at the other corner. So it would have been, these lagoons tended to get the seawater coming in from seepage through the barrier, which is a kind of a shingle barrier. But it would have a salt content. Now, because of the change in the configuration, there's actually channels coming in and out. In winter, there would be hundreds of water birds here and wading birds, different shore birds, including curlews, widgeon, and a whole range of other species. But most of them will have gone to their breeding grounds. So we'll only be seeing a few of the different birds, but I think it's important that you're aware of it. It's bordered by peatland. You'll see that. And then in the central part where those sheep are grazing, it's what we call a salt marsh. A salt marsh is a kind of a grassland area that is periodically covered by the tide. So when you get the spring tide coming in, it actually covers that area. So only plants that can actually tolerate salt, so sort of coastal plants, will be able to survive out there in terms of grasses and flowering plants. And unfortunately, it's heavily grazed. And then, of course, you have the peat area, and then we'll see the shingle bank, and there's a lovely rocky shore behind it. So there are two outlets at the moment. You can walk around the area on most days, but you need a pair of Wellingtons, and you need to be very careful because you have to go through a few channels. At this time of the year, there aren't many birds, I'm sorry to say. But, you know, we might see some birds on the shore. The vegetation here, one thing to note is, I mean, we have our alder trees. Willow is a very important tree for pollinators in the spring. That's when I see the bees in my garden, they're usually feeding on the catkins of the willow trees. And we have, obviously, a very typical plant of this part of Ireland is the fuchsia, which you get lining the hedgerows here. But unfortunately, we do also have other species that have been introduced as ornamental plants. The giant rhubarb, which is on the way down here, there's areas of the island that are completely covered in it. Rhododendron is coming into flower, and it's a beautiful flower. It's a beautiful plant. But unfortunately, if it's not managed in the landscape, it completely covers the landscape, particularly where in peaty areas where they've drained the land so it's drier, and you'll see that. Just on the sides of the road here, you'll have Himalayan balsam, which is a non-native species that is actually also spreading. And of course, you have Japanese knotweed as well. And I just mentioned them as 4 examples of different types of plants that aren't native, that have been introduced for ornamental purposes, but have spread wild in the landscape. And if they're not controlled, they can spread over areas, and particularly the rhododendron can completely choke up. You hear about in the forest in Killarney, the oak wood, because unfortunately the rhododendron got out of control, the oak trees are actually dying because there's so much rhododendron that's actually choking them. So it's again, it's a question of a lack of balance, and people introduce plants and animals thinking that they're not going to do any harm. And then, it's like the mink. There are mink on Achill Island, unfortunately. And in an area where you get mink, the birds, the nesting birds, don't have a chance. You'll see little mallard hatching out in areas, and then, of course, a few days later, they're all gone because the mink have taken them. And they have, obviously, mink were introduced for fur farms, and then, of course, they escaped and maybe sometimes released, and they spread, and of course, they are major predators of ground nesting birds. So it's where you get that imbalance, and sometimes non-native species can thrive in ways that were not envisaged and do a lot of harm. All wondering where the birds are. Well, the tide is still quite a deal out. This part of the island, it's a very rocky shoreline. It's a kind of a boulder, rocky shoreline, backed by a shingle bank, and then of course you can see the peat behind it. This lower part of Blacksod Bay is quite shallow. I don't know if Sheila, where are you? Yeah, I saw on a recent map it's called Bullon Bay. Bullon Bay, because it's out like Bullock Island, and so this area is quite shallow in terms of the whole area of the marine environment. And in winter, you would get several hundred great northern divers. They are, in America, they're called loons. They are marine birds. They're like how would I describe them? I don't know if you like, the cormorant is a kind of a black marine bird, but these tend to be equivalent in size, and they're quite primitive looking. They don't look very gaily in flight, but they're perfectly adapted to living out there, and they're feeding on crabs and other fish. And this would be one of the best places in Ireland, Blacksod Bay, to see them. And in spring, unfortunately, I don't know if we can see any at the moment. We might see one as we walk. Over at the pier at the Valley, they sometimes come in very close. And in spring, they gather in flocks. They're normally solitary in winter. And in spring, they gather in flocks. They're coming into summer plumage. And I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember the movie On Golden Pond. Right. Okay. Okay. It's a lovely movie with Katharine Hepburn and Henry Fonda. And the loons are in that movie. In fact, to me, they were the stars. And they have this beautiful wailing call. It's kind of a lonesome kind of call of wilderness. And sometimes on a calm day here in April or early May, if you're over at the Valley Pier, you can hear them calling to each other. So there might be a flock of 70 or 80 birds that have gathered before they migrate, and they'll be gone in the next week or two, and they're heading up to Iceland or Canada. So that's just to give you an idea of one of the birds. There'd be other birds out there, scoters. They are sea ducks. They're black ducks. There'd be several hundred of them. And not this winter past, but the previous winter, there was an extremely rare American scoter called a white-winged scoter, never seen in Ireland before. It was just off the pier there. It spent several weeks in the winter. It made Achill Island famous among the birdwatching community for a short period. So that shallow area, there's different birds, and when you get storms, kind of as you frequently do at different times of the year, birds will come in here and take shelter. So that's one element of the marine environment. The coastline here, the rocky shoreline, will also provide feeding for many of the wading birds, the oyster catchers, the curlews. There's another little bird, which is our big bird. It's like a small curlew. It's called a whimbrel, and it's passing through on its migration to Iceland. It's called a May bird, and it's got a very distinctive call. We should hear them or see them. They're on the other side of the island over at Kiel as well. And so there's also, because there's lots of periwinkles out there, it's a rich food supply for birds, but there's also a rich food supply for people that gather periwinkles. And frequently you'll see maybe 7 or 8 people out there. You can see them out there today, and they are out gathering periwinkles. There's also periwinkle gathering over on the shoreline over there, and over at Kiel, over at on the Macaire, out to Carron Point. There's where the little settlement, the ruins were. There was a midden there of shellfish, which was kind of like the throwaways of the what people were eating from the shore. And there would have been a lot of periwinkles, a lot of limpets, different shellfish. So people living here would have definitely lived off the sea. And I'm sure during famine times, it would have been absolutely critical. So, there's no question about the fact that people in these coastal areas, that would have been critical for their survival, as the seaweed would have been critical in many of these communities. And, people probably would have fought over actually access to the rights of the seashore. But I feel if you're going to have a commercial exploitation of seafood, shellfish, it should be done in a way that ensures its sustainability. But it happens in different countries. I remember when I was I used to work for the EU in Brussels on nature policy, and we had a case once against the Netherlands for cockle fishing in the Waddenzee, where there was a big commercial exploitation, and it was at a scale that there wasn't even food left for the birds. So they destroyed the mussel beds because the mussel required stability. So this kind of dredging for cockles was actually causing serious damage to the ecosystem, and the Netherlands was condemned by the court in Luxembourg for failing to ensure the sustainability of the practice. So, you need to if you're going to exploit natural resources, you need to ensure that it's sustainable. And that would be my kind of take-home message. Not to say you can't do something, but to say that if you're going to do it on a commercial scale, you need to ensure that it's actually the harvest is... Because, the history, if you take what happened on this island with the basking shark back in the 40s, 50s, I mean, there was a really important employment provided to people on the island that came and were spending the summer, kind of harvesting basking shark. But there was no limits, no controls. And after, a period, the basking sharks weren't coming back again, or they were doing so in greatly diminished numbers. So if you don't look after a fishery, you're basically not going to have the resource. So this here rocky shoreline, in winter, there would be a lot more birds out there. There are a few sandwich terns on the shoreline, and if anybody hasn't seen a sandwich tern, They can look through the telescope if they don't believe me. There were about 250 of them here during the week. They've come back from Ghana, and the sandwich tern, maybe if I tell you what a tern is, it's like a small seagull. They are very, very elegant seabirds. They're very pale. Another name that they're called sea swallows, because they tend to have long tails, and they tend to be very agile in terms of flying around on the coast. They have this extraordinary capacity. They hover over a point and then they dive into the sea to catch small little sand eels and sprats. They've spent the winter off West Africa. In fact, some of the birds, the Arctic tern, actually can go as far north, way inside the Arctic Circle, and then spend the winter in Antarctica. So they've extraordinary capacity. And I was here during the week because the birds have come back. They've been here, they feed, there's rich feeding here. They don't nest here, they nest probably around on little islets around black sod. But there were about 250 of the sandwich terns here during the week. And I was looking at them, and of course they're engaged in courtship. Before they move to their nesting colonies, they're trying to find a mate. So the male comes in with a big sand eel, and of course he's trying to entice the female to show interest in him. And they kind of engage in this courtship feeding, and then you see the mating taking place. So it's all excitement. So I was there during the week, and this is what I don't know if you can see, that's them along the shoreline. The sandwich tern there's about 5 different types of terns that you get here. And I was looking at them on Tuesday and Wednesday, and one of the birds looked different. I don't know if you can see closely in terms of that picture, but one of the birds had a yellow bill, and it was slightly bigger. And that bird actually isn't a sandwich tern, it's an elegant tern. That actually, but they're all elegant, but that actually bird should be on the Pacific coast of California and Mexico. It was taken as, one good tern deserves another. Right. No, actually, and that's only been seen in Ireland 7 times previously. So it's an extremely rare bird in Europe. And it was in among the sandwich terns. And you know, it probably has got caught up. It's probably gone down around South America in winter, come up the Atlantic, got caught up in a migration of birds and ended up in Europe. And I expect it'll probably think it's a sandwich tern and spend the summer in one of the colonies. So unfortunately it wasn't here, but there would be several hundred of them here, and they roost in on the lake at high tide, and they feed on these shallow waters. So we might get closer to them as we get down, but just that you can get a sense. So that's the Cockle. It's a very shallow lake. There would be fish in there as well, mullet, and of course you'd get different types of birds. There are a few ducks around. There's red-breasted mergansers that are here. They're kind of sea ducks, and they have these kind of serrated bills. They have these long bills for catching fish. So they're like a scissors, you know, these for sewing, and they have these serrated edge. Yeah. There's shell duck here, which is an interesting duck. Most ducks, the female is very drab brown, because she's the one that takes total responsibility for incubating and sitting on the nest. But the shell duck, the male and the female, look the same. They're black and white. There's a few pairs here, and they will be nesting in burrows underground. They nest in rabbit burrows and other underground. So the female doesn't need to be camouflaged. And the interesting thing about the shell duck is that when the male and the female, they will look after the young when they hatch out, but they sometimes form groups of several families called creches. So you could come here and you'd see maybe 20, 30 young that would be with the adults as they gather. And a lot of the shelduck, once they've finished nesting, they will emigrate over to the Bodensee in late summer, and there'd maybe 100,000 shelduck in the Bodensee between Denmark, Germany and the Netherlands. And that's where they undergo a molt, because the water birds, the ducks, they shed their flying feathers during the late summer. So they're completely flightless for a period of several weeks. They're very vulnerable, so they have to go to safe areas, and so there's a big migration from there. So there'll be a small population around here. There are some cormorants that were actually out there on the shoreline. If we worked our way down further, there's another little bird here called the ringed plover, which there's about 10 pairs nesting further down there on the shingle. Probably best to avoid that area at the moment because they're quite vulnerable. But if you go near them, the adult, particularly when the young are around, rather than flying away, will actually pretend it's got a broken wing, and it will lure you away from the area by, if it's a predator, you think there's an injured bird and an easy meal, and of course the tendency is to follow the bird, and they bring you away from the nest. So that's its strategy. So that's another bird that you get here. There was another bird, it's like a small curlew. There was a flock of about 200 of them here, and they're probably still here, but they're not visible. And they're called godwits. And they are bar-tailed godwits. And I'll just show you a picture. They are heading up to Arctic Russia. The nearest breeding area is probably in the north of Finland, in the Arctic. And the interesting thing about them is sometimes people ring the birds, and I don't know if you can see that bird. There's a tag on that bird, ECE. It's a godwit that I saw, on the shoreline there. It was there last week. It was there 2 days ago. That bird was ringed in Norway last August. And last autumn it was seen on the Isle of Skye in Scotland. And it's obviously spent the winter here in Ireland, and it'll probably head north in the next few weeks up to the Arctic breeding grounds. So if you can see it there, you see, sorry.
You know that house we looked at over the water, just and where the cormorants were, and just this side on the grass. Oh.
Yeah, you could. Yeah. There would be hooded crows here, definitely. Yeah. Yeah. They'd be nesting in the trees over there. There's grey herons nesting there. But I suggest, that we probably, unless there's questions, we start heading back so that you don't miss your lunch, and maybe use your bird app. We might hear some birds on the way back.